The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime. Hello, it's The Week in Art. I'm Ben Luke. This week, Seoul, the growing centre for contemporary art. We talk to a curator and gallerists about the Korean scene. Plus, a horsehair basket by Dahye Jeong, winner of the Loewe Foundation Craft Prize. On Wednesday, Frieze announced the details of the first edition of its art fair in Seoul, South Korea. So, for this last episode of the current season, we're exploring the art scene and market in the Korean capital. I talked to the art historian and curator Jiyoon Lee about contemporary art in Seoul and beyond. Our associate editor, Kabir Jhala, speaks to two gallerists, Joorhee Kwon, deputy director at the Kukje Gallery, which opened in Seoul in 1982, and Emma Sun, senior director at Lehmann Maupin, one of the increasing number of galleries from the US and Europe to have opened a space in the Korean capital. And in this episode's Work of the Week, Kabir talks to the creative director at the fashion brand Loewe, Jonathan Anderson, about the winner of the Loewe Foundation Craft Prize, Dahye Jeong's A Time of Sincerity, a horsehair basket that's on view as part of the prize exhibition at the Seoul Museum of Craft Art. Before all that, why not try a digital subscription to the art newspaper? The price for the first 3 months is £1, $1 or €1, depending on where you live, and then it's £10, $10 and €10 per quarter afterwards. You get full access to the website and the app for iOS and Android, plus the e-paper archive of the newspaper and fair dailies. Go to theartnewspaper.com, click subscribe, and the promo code is TRIAL, all in capital letters. Do also subscribe to this podcast, wherever you're listening now. Now, the arrival of the Frieze Art Fair in Seoul confirms the city's rise to being a key Asian centre for the global art market. And one of the reasons for Seoul's growing importance is that it's long had a thriving art scene. I spoke to Jiyoon Lee, an art historian and one of the most prominent curators of contemporary art in Korea. She co-curated elements of biennials in Busan in Korea in 2006, Liverpool in the UK in 2008, and the Venice Biennale in 2009. She was a director of a branch of MMCA, the National Modern and Contemporary Art Museum in Seoul, and is also the founder of an independent curatorial agency called Zoom. I spoke to her about the Korean contemporary scene ahead of Frieze's arrival in the city. Jiyoon, I wanted to begin by talking about the Korean scene because one of the reasons we're talking is because Frieze is coming to Seoul and there's a very big focus on Western galleries and the Western influx, if you like, into the Korean art scene. But actually the Korean scene is a very mature scene. It's several generations of contemporary artists and institutions. Can you tell me a bit about the Korean scene and, if you like, the kind of key aspects of the scene that make it so distinctive?
Yes, as you said, it was, I think, pretty mature market. In particular, last 15 years, it was pretty interestingly, developed. Western important galleries appearance in last, 3 to 5 years. It's not just a coincidence. They start to come in a day because surprisingly, the Korean collectors, their development and their collection establishment, it's not just in last 5 years emergence. Because what I have surprised when I come back to Korea, as a curator and as a contemporary art museum director for the MMCA Seoul director, I was really surprised. There are many interesting, sophisticated collectors. They were not really showing off their collections, very, very modest, but they were very knowledgeable and they were very much aware of, contemporary artists. So in that sense, I think it was really, right time. The Western galleries understood the importance of Korean market. Maybe that's why they start to open their galleries finally, in Korea.
Did those collectors that you're talking about collect both Korean and international art, or were they more focused on one or the other?
The collectors, what I mentioned, it's not only for the Korean art, for the international art works as well. Maybe that's why, the international art galleries start to come to Korea in last 5 years. But particularly in last 2-3 years, more galleries start to come.
I wanted to also explore the role of the historic scenes, because there have been artistic communities in Seoul and beyond for many decades. Can you say something about those historic communities and how central they are to the scene now and how much influence they have, if you like?
Yeah, I think contemporary art communities, especially, start to get engaged since 1993, if I may say, because Korea start to come to Venice Biennial in 1993, in the Venice Biennial as the first Korean pavilion. And then the Gwangju Biennial opens in 1995 in Korea. So that is, very important years. Korean contemporary artist scene start to engage with international art scene. Because as you know that, Korea held Olympic Games 1988. So since then, Korean globalisation started to being held. And then normal Korean people start to being able to travel to foreign country since 1989 only. You'll be very surprised. Korean people cannot travel to a foreign country without any permission. It wasn't possible. So after the Olympic Games, people only be able to travel to foreign country. For the European tour and European museum tours only be possible after 1989. So I think that was really interesting moment to see that even artists can travel to other countries for foreign studies. So I think contemporary scenes, we can say that it's only start to get engaged finally, properly, after 1990s.
That's really interesting. I hadn't realised until I was reading around the Seoul scene that in 1993, the Whitney Biennial came to Seoul, and this was part of Nam June Paik's initiative. Can you say something about that, and how important was that?
I think Nam June Paik, as one of the important Korean artists, and has really made a great help for Korean art to oversee as well, because the Gwangju Biennial held for the first time in 1995. Nam June Paik helped for the Daejeon Expo 1994. At that time, he helped one of the expo in 1994. So he really, started to bring international art specialists to Korea. And then also, bring this Whitney Biennial to Korea in 1993. So he really, started to bring all the museum, the MoMA director and Whitney Biennial directors, all these people to Korea, start to show the Korean artists, and then, start to open up these, doors. I actually wrote my thesis, The Impact of Globalization, with Julian Stalabras, professor at Courtauld Art Institute, about my PhD thesis. So actually, I researched in that area. So, Nam June Paik, did a great impact and the influence on that area and Lie's, work. That's why in 1995, when the Gwangju Biennial opens, at that time, it was really important year. At that year, the audiences were more than 1 million people visited the Gwangju Biennial. And also government actually spent $1 million budget to make that Gwangju Biennale possible.
Right. And is that really important in the state support for contemporary art, in the sense that it has been seen as a leading way to promote Korea to the world, if you like? Contemporary art's at the heart of that.
I think compared to the other Asian countries, I think Korea was our biggest government and state support in contemporary artist supporting country. particularly, for two biennials, one for the Gwangju Biennial and second for the Busan Biennial. These two biennials, one in 1995 for the Busan Biennale, started in 1998. Of course, Gwangju had a much bigger budget and Busan has a little bit lesser budget, but these two biennials receive a big budget from the government. Busan actually from the Busan city, but these two biennials really start to play a very important roles for the international art scene, but at the same time really fostering the Korean contemporary artists to producing the new commission work and really becoming a platform to engage with international artists and curators and to understand the language of contemporary art practices.
And you worked on the Busan Biennial in 2006, I believe. Can you tell me something about what it had established by that time in terms of the balance between Korean and international artists?
I think year 2006 was very interesting year. We worked not only in the Busan City Art Museum. Our site was in the Bay 3,000 square meter big warehouse. Making a contemporary art exhibition in a beautiful museum is a one thing, but making a big exhibition in a big warehouse is another great challenge.
Indeed.
All curators were really amazing because Tobias Berger, now, he's running the great, museum in Hong Kong. Everybody, Claire Stabler, he was working at the Palais de Tokyo. It was really, active curators, 6 curators working together, making this gigantic warehouse into a contemporary venue. With a tight budget, but we produced a fantastic, very experimental exhibition. Everybody really remembered that exhibition. Almost many works were all commissioned and new production. I think it was a really interesting moment. It's not like big budget exhibition making like now, because nowadays, without any big gallery support with a big budget, it's almost impossible to, making a big exhibition. But at that time, with a great effort of the curators as a producer, with a great artist, amazing effort to producing together with the curators, it was an amazing moment.
Is it significant that the two sort of biggest biennales, if you like, in Gwangju and Busan, were outside of Seoul, and so therefore artist communities developed not just in the capital? Was that significant?
I think even though those two biennials held in those two cities, but artists always come back to Seoul, and then those artists did lots of lectures and talks in the National Contemporary Art Museum. Also, we had the Media Art Biennale in Metropolitan City Art Museum at the time. That's why even though it was held in other two cities, we are all connected in Seoul as well. Of course, the two other cities, but I think Seoul was one of the also very important Mecca.
Can you say something about the contemporary scene today in Seoul in terms of artistic communities? Of course, it's a vast city. It's 25 million people. So do you have multiple art communities, or is it the central community located in a particular area?
I think compared to 10 years ago, I think at that time, artistic communities were much more experimental and active in artistic communities. But unfortunately, at the moment, it was much more commercially driven atmosphere, I must admit and I must say. Because nowadays, art market really opens. But it's not only in Korea, it's really everywhere in other cities as well. Because it's not Biennale driven, it's not really art residency and the museum driven atmosphere. It's much more gallery driven, the art fair driven. That sort of atmosphere is happening in Korea now too. That's why many of important galleries is happening in the Samcheong-dong, nearby MMCA, and the Kukje Gallery and the Hyundai Gallery and that area, the Samcheong-dong, and then Hannam-dong. That's where another important Western galleries residing, Pace Gallery and the Ropak Gallery and those gallery area. Another like South Kensington, if we say, that sort of area. Those are three galleries areas are really driven for the contemporary art scenes, leading places.
And so do you have concerns then about Frieze's arrival? And if you're already concerned about the sort of commercial impact on the contemporary scene, how do you greet Frieze's arrival?
Well, some of Korean local galleries are a little bit, showing their concerns. Well, if these international galleries' arrival maybe kill the Korean market, and many of collectors will maybe buy only international artists, maybe they will sell the Korean artist, they will not buy Korean art because it's not going to have any investment value and so on. So many people actually show a lot of worries and concerns. But in my opinion, I think it can be a very positive challenge because when the movie market opens, at that time there were many demonstrations from the movie sectors, and they say that you must have a certain quota have to be addressed against the Korean films. You must give a certain the margin for the Korean films. There are many policies, rates provided for the Korean films to protect, for the Korean film markets and so on. But in the end, Korean film became much more, competitive. They really made a great effort to become much more interesting. They really trying to make a better stories. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons Korean film became much more interesting now. And maybe now they, got the best awards in many Cannes and the Academy Award right now. That's why I think, maybe they feel a little bit scared and a bit worried now. But I think, it can bring a certain open competition. And I think Korean young artists can see the global trend right away. The Korean young artists can see what's going on out there. They can really compete with the young artists. And I think we can have another chance for the Korean artists to oversee as well. And then some great Western dealers can find the great Korean artist talents as well. So I rather see it can be a great opportunities in the long-term based.
One of the interesting things is that this September there was an exhibition at LACMA in Los Angeles about modern Korean art. There's also a show in which the Guggenheim and MMCA are collaborating, looking at avant-garde art of the 60s and 70s. Do you feel optimistic about the way that not just Korea as a scene, but also Korean art in the modern and contemporary period will be understood more widely now? Do you feel quite optimistic about its increasing relevance and increasing understanding of it globally?
Yes, I really think this was really right timing, and it's really important to have that exhibition right now. Because 1960s and 70s, this avant-garde artist movement was very, very important. But in last, 50 years, unfortunately, the Gutai movement have been really internationally addressed in many museums internationally. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, this 1960s and 70s Korean modern art, particularly for the Tansekwa, this kind of paintings has been addressed through some of the galleries. But this 60s and 70s performance-based and experimental performance-based artworks has not been properly revisited and then researched. That's why I think MMCA has really intensive research materials and great scholars as curators. And their collaboration with LACMA and Guggenheim in this kind of proper collaboration, and they have been researching more than 3 years, but because of COVID, research period has been added. So This kind of exhibition together can give in-depth the background and knowledge to provide a platform, giving a platform to understand the Korean art now more. Because, understand the Korean contemporary art, it's a bit difficult, without understanding of this kind of, in-depth process of this avant-garde, the whole process in last 30, 40 years. That's why I'm very, very pleased to see this kind of important historical exhibition finally held in this important international institution finally now. Then under the basis of these, more interesting contemporary artist works can be shown more and more after.
Well, Jiyoon, thank you so much for talking to me today.
You're welcome.
The exhibition I mentioned at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA, The Space Between, The Modern in Korean Art, runs from the 11th of September to the 19th of February next year. As yet, there are no confirmed dates for the exhibition The Avant-Garde, Experimental Art in South Korea in the 1960s and 1970s at MMCA or the Guggenheim. Keep an eye on the gallery's websites for details. Coming up, we hear from Kukje Gallery and Lehmann Maupin about the gallery scene in Seoul, and Jonathan Anderson tells us about the winner of the Loewe Foundation Craft Prize. But first, here's this week's news bulletin. The Orlando Museum of Art, or OMA, has fired the institution's director and chief executive, Aaron de Groft. The sacking follows a scandal surrounding a Jean-Michel Basquiat exhibition at the museum that ended abruptly on the 24th of June when the FBI raided it and seized 25 paintings amid questions about their authenticity. The chair of the OMA's Board of Trustees, Cynthia Brumbach, said that the board was concerned about several issues relating to the exhibition, including inappropriate email correspondence sent to academia concerning the authentication of its works. An official process to address these matters has been launched. Concerns about the authenticity of the purported Basquiat works were first made public in a New York Times article in February. At the time, de Groft told the newspaper, quote, "My reputation is at stake as well, and I've absolutely no doubt these are Basquiat's." Daniel Weiss, President and Chief Executive of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, has announced that he'll step down in June 2023. Weiss was appointed President in 2015 and Chief Executive in 2017 and guided the Met through several major challenges during his tenure, including balancing the museum's $310 million operating budget, raising more than $1.5 billion in private support, and overseeing, among other projects, the $40 million renovation of the ancient Near Eastern and Cypriot galleries and the $500 million refurbishment of the modern wing. Weiss also served as the interim director of the Met between the departure of its former director, Thomas Campbell, in 2017 and the appointment of the current director, Max Hollein, in 2018. He also helped navigate the controversy surrounding donations from the Sackler family and the ultimate removal of the Sackler name from 7 galleries of the museum in 2021. In a statement, Weiss said that he has every confidence that the museum is on a path to a strong future. TEFAF Maastricht was evacuated on Tuesday after several men, at least one of whom was reportedly armed, attempted to rob a jewellery stand. Images circulating on social media showed 2 vitrines were damaged on the stand of the London dealer Symbolic and Chase, and some jewellery was taken. In a video, one man was seen smashing a glass cabinet with a mallet, while others warded off other dealers and visitors. One appeared to be holding a gun. TEFAF said that the fair was evacuated, the Dutch police were on site within minutes, and nobody was injured during the incident. Limburg police said that 2 men, a 22-year-old and a 26-year-old man, both from Belgium, were arrested shortly after the robbery. You can read more about all these stories on the website and the app. We'll be back after this. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Beginning on the 13th of July, Christie's New York presents the chance to view July's Contemporary Art Online series in person. Engage with works by defining artists such as Andy Warhol, Keith Haring and David Hockney. Discover examples by Ernie Barnes, Shabalala Self, Shara Hughes and Cause that bring new momentum to the market. As the summer continues, explore Christie's rotating exhibitions featuring the great indoors, Dream Big and more from private sales. Find out more at christies.com. Welcome back. Now, Frieze's arrival in Seoul follows a significant increase in international galleries setting up outposts in the city, where they've joined a long-established gallery scene. Our associate editor, Kabir Jhala, is in Seoul and has spoken to representatives of 2 galleries. A bit later, we'll hear from Emma Sun, senior director at Lehmann Maupin, the US gallery that first opened a space in the Korean capital in 2017 and in March opened a new gallery in the Hanam-dong district. But first, Kabir spoke to Joorhee Kwon, deputy director at the Kukje Gallery, a key player in Seoul's art scene since 1982.
Hi Joorhee, thanks so much for joining me. So you're in Korea right now in the Seoul Gallery Kukje, which was established in 1982. And to my mind, it's probably the most internationally recognized Korean gallery. So you represent, I'd say, a pretty even split between international and Korean artists, and the international artists that you do represent are some really big blue chip artists. You represent Louise Bourgeois, Jenny Holzer, Anish Kapoor. At the same time, the gallery also represents some of the biggest names in contemporary Korean art, like Haegi Yang and Sun Suk Moon. And so back when you started the gallery and in those first, 15 years, who were the collectors? What was the collecting scene like? Because obviously I know with, Korea's unique history, there wasn't probably a lot of generational wealth that had developed by the 1980s. So who was snapping up contemporary art then to justify opening a contemporary art gallery?
So the individuals who have been collecting traditionally aren't too different from the pool of collectors that we have in Korea now. So they're mostly the major kind of businessmen. And actually Korea has quite a bit of private museums that, come from these private collections. And even though this is on an incomparably large scale, the Liam Museum of Art by Samsung is just one example of how impressive these collections can get. And back in the 1980s, collecting was more focused on antiquities. So, traditional Korean ceramics, such as the moon jars, and also the kind of traditional shanshui, also known as, kind of the traditional Korean and Chinese landscape paintings. That was more in trend. However, from the 1980s, 90s-ish, the trend became a lot more contemporary as these big name artists started, coming into the Korean art scene. In the 1980s and 90s, we felt that it was imperative to educate the local audience on art and its importance, as the awareness, interest, and the infrastructure for arts and culture was relatively lacking. And so at Kukje Gallery, we've been holding weekly academy events for the clients at the gallery and continue to do so even today. And also in terms of the gallery's programming, we used to be more focused on the big names like Alexander Calder and Louise Bourgeois and Frank Stella and so on. Now that our audience has, fostered a keen eye and cultivated, their kind of individual tastes, which means that they are ready to explore contemporary art. We've been focusing more on the younger, more up-and-coming artists and also more international contemporary artists. So recently we held shows with, for example, Elm Green and Draxet, Michael Ju, Jenny Holzer is another big name. And so now we have about 50 artists on a roster. And we're representing a wide range of artists and estates, ranging from Lee Young-kook, who is a pioneering Korean abstractionist who was born in 1916, to Korakrit Aranan Nonchai, who is a young Thai multimedia artist. So it's really a range.
And now, fast forwarding to the modern day when Seoul is at this sort of precipice point, massive art market ascendancy, how have collecting habits shifted in the past 40 years? What kind of trends are we seeing? You know, are collectors now skewing younger? Are they interested in different mediums? You know?
Yes, we have seen a recent rise of younger generations of collectors ranging from their 20s even to their 40s. And this is actually a very recent phenomenon in Korea, which can be attributed to the pandemic. Because borders closed down due to the pandemic, the wealthier class starts to do what we generally call in Korea revenge spending.
Right.
And so first, that basic trend was generally seen with luxury brands, but then art, in a sense, became the next level. So because we participate in about 4 to 5 domestic art fairs per year, we saw a huge spike of younger collectors who really want to get a roll on with their collections. And even though the general price range of what these younger collectors buy tend to be slightly on the smaller scale as compared to existing collectors, when you sum them up, it does account for a significant portion of our sales.
Something that I hear from people who are ingrained in the Korean art world is that Korean collectors, especially young collectors, they're more interested in Western and international art, actually, than they are in buying Korean contemporary art. I mean, would you say that this is a fair point, or would you butt against it?
I would bet against it because it's really a range. We have collectors who are looking for young Korean artists. We have collectors looking for edition pieces by our Tansekwa masters like Park Sebo and Ha Jong-hyun, and they get sold out very quickly. And also then we have collectors who are looking for Jenny Holzer, Kapoor, Otoniel. So it's really a range, and it just depends on their taste and what they feel like is a good investment.
Could you pinpoint the international works that really succeed in Korea? If an international gallery is coming to a fair in Korea, as obviously 118 will very soon, what would you suggest you bring? Is there something that you can kind of sense Korean buyers really like and that a gallery would sell well if they brought to the fair?
I think Korean collectors are into works that have character. So it shows that artist's kind of signature. I guess, whether it be motif or technique or material even. For example, with Otoniel, it's the glass beads. With OP, it's the very kind of abstract figures. With Ugo Rondinoni, there's a range. But for example, with the color mountains, they're very, characteristic and signature to the artist. So whatever is very kind of representational and also what can be, immediately recognized as a work by that artist, I think the Korean collectors are more inclined to prefer.
So I think the most germane question that everyone's sort of asking, we're certainly asking right now, is Free Seoul rears its head, is why now? Why has Seoul and South Korea become such a buzzword in the art world and in the art market? Why is Korea's star so ascendant? So how long do you think it's been in the works that Korea would become this real power player on the, not even the East Asian market scene, the global market scene? And why do you think it's now that Korea is really about to take its place on the global stage as an art market hub?
I think the biggest attribute of the Korean art scene and what is appealing for both regional and international art professionals worldwide is the artists that we have in Korea. In the recent decade, Tansekwa has really found its niche in the modern and contemporary art history. And artists like Hae Yang, for example, they've been really just very active all over the globe. So people recognize, what Korean art is and who the Korean artists are, which is a huge appeal. I feel like an art market cannot exist if it doesn't have its artists. And another factor is, and this is tying back to my comment with regards to the younger generations of collectors, I feel like no other region in this world has seen such a conspicuous rise of a whole new generation of younger collectors in recent years, well, more so than Korea at least. And this provides a prospect and also a future within the art market that a lot of international galleries, I feel like, are going to want to explore, and not only explore, but also to develop and foster.
So Kukje has participated in KIAF, the Korean International Art Fair, for many years now. Could you give our listeners a sense of the importance of KIAF in the Korean art world calendar, and also, what you think Frieze Seoul coming in and partnering with KIAF is going to mean? Will the two sort of be sibling fairs, or do you sort of foresee some rivalry going on here?
So Kukje Gallery has been participating in KIAF since 2003. And KIAF was actually launched in 2002. And it's one of the most important and longest running art fairs in Korea. KIAF has consistently supported contemporary art in Korea by focusing on emerging talent and establishing a reputation as one of Asia's leading art fairs. And while Kukje participates in major international art fairs around the world, such as Art Basel and Frieze, we've always shown the dedication to supporting domestic fairs, and we take much into care and consideration when preparing for them. And KIAF is definitely one of our most important events on the art fair calendar for us, since it's the largest and the most important fair in our home ground. And our founder, Hyun-Suk Lee, was the 14th president of the Galleries Association of Korea, which organizes KIAF. And, having that history makes our connection to the fair a lot more meaningful.
So are you going to have to choose between KIAF and Frieze Seoul this year? Are you going to show at both fairs, or are you going to only choose one?
We're one of the few galleries that's doing both fairs.
So another question that people are obviously going to be asking themselves is, what are the benefits, but also the potential downsides of this new influx of attention and money from the West that I think Frieze Seoul pretty accurately represents? Because I think when you think of Seoul, it's also really important to think of what the biggest hub for the art market is in East Asia, which is Hong Kong, and continues to be today, but at the moment is kind of seeing its star falling a little bit. And something that I always notice when I speak to a lot of Hong Kong artists, when I speak to people who have Hong Kong art spaces, not necessarily Hong Kong art dealers, but Hong Kong art spaces, is they say that to some extent, all that huge amount of wealth from the West that came into Hong Kong over the last 20 years in the art market has actually not been amazing for the city's artists. It really privileges Western artists, it privileges Western galleries with spaces out there, and it privileges Christie's and Sotheby's. But necessarily, I don't think that Hong Kong artists have benefited a huge amount. Obviously, as someone who is so ingrained in the Seoul scene, who is Korean, I'm sure you also want to, preserve some sense of Koreanness as the international wealth flows into the city. So how do we avoid Seoul, necessarily becoming overtaken by the international art world?
So as of now, because this is happening no matter what, we are more hopeful that the international attention on the Korean art market will further stimulate and enlarge its scale. And hopefully, this will bring further opportunities to the country's local artists. And as you already know, we have a very strong roster of local artists in Korea. And in turn, we do want the Western galleries to bring their pool of artists into the Korean market. And we want our Korean collectors to experience and see what the rest of the art world has to offer. And even though competition is, of course, inevitable, that has always been the case. And we hope that it will, in the end, turn out to be a healthy and a mutually beneficial one. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Joorhee, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
So Emma, you're in Korea now, speaking from Lehmann Maupin's gallery in Seoul, which you have directed since it was established in 2017. Now, 2017 doesn't seem like a huge amount of time ago, but the art scene in Seoul has really exploded in that time since. So I thought we'd first establish, why did Lehmann Maupin decide to open a Korea branch? And then also, what was the scene like in 2017 when you opened?
The Lehmann Maupin has long kept its aim to present artists in new geographies and to diversify the local art markets. So opening of Lehmann Maupin Seoul was actually a natural result of this intent. As the city, as you put it, has grown in prominence both regionally and internationally. Korea has been very international with all the biennales in Gwangju and Busan, also in Seoul with the city media. But appearance of international galleries like Lehmann Maupin and Pace and Paratan has actually added a different layer to the city's art market, and it's, I think, helped boost the appearance actually and prominence of the city and the nation internationally, I think.
So how many Western galleries had branches in Seoul when Lehmann Maupin set up?
So I think it's only us and Pace and Paratan, I believe, at the time that had an actual space. So, our new space is the progression of that expensive and ambitious programming we have organized since the launch.
So yeah, if you could tell me a little bit about your new space, because Lehmann Maupin announced last year that it was opening up a new location in Seoul.
So our new gallery space is double the size of our previous space, so that it allows our artists to push the boundaries of their mediums. And for our team members, a bigger space allows us to diversify the types of exhibitions we mount and play with the scale, enabling the visitors to also engage with multiple aspects of an artist's practice in a way they weren't able to before.
So when Lehmann Maupin opened their Seoul gallery, they already had a Hong Kong branch. So I want to know, why did you not just stop there? You already have a base in East Asia that you can then do the fairs with. So why did you then open up a Seoul branch?
I think in terms of establishing a whole operation here in Seoul, I think the city's cultural importance, emerging collector base, and really wonderful collaboration with the Korean museums and biennales may be the three main reasons that we thought was important to actually have a space. And also, as you know, that we worked with a really important Korean artists from the very beginning, Libo and Do Ho-seo, and also we represented So Se-ok. So that also played a lot of reasons for us to be here.
Interesting. So Emma, if I was a Western gallerist and I said, hey Emma, I want to open a space in Seoul, I want to know some of the pressure points and the hurdles that I should consider when I'm opening a Seoul space, what would you say to me? And, what are the best ways to overcome these issues?
So I think just one and, only thing that really comes to my mind is right person to help you set up everything and also operate on behalf of you. It's international city, but at the same time, you really have to have someone based in Korea who knows the art scenes and, who people in the art market trust and who can be a leader, because it's not just about showing artist works, it's also about, operating a business. So we really need someone who can speak both Korean and English so you can communicate and do the business. I think that's really essential.
So again, I'm a Western gallerist looking for some advice to open up in Seoul. On a more positive note, what are some of the things that you would tell me are really good about Seoul, from a perspective of ease of doing business, of taxes, of this sort of scene? What is it on a sort of business level that you think is drawing galleries here? Because obviously, there are great museums, there are great artists. A lot of cities have great museums and great artists. There is clearly a reason why people are really being attracted to Seoul. It's the collectors, it is the sort of nitty-gritty of it. So what is it about Seoul?
I think it's all of that. We do have great museums city-wise and, all regionally. There's also new state museums are opening up and have setting up great spaces. And also there are a growing number of young collector base, which is positive in that sense. Also, We have wonderful artists in Korea that you can look forward to, working and presenting and finding out. But also what I think business-wise, what's attracting for collectors also is that the art is still tax-free here, except for the photographies. Photography, we do have 10% tax. And also, I think the geography of Korea, it could become a hub like in Hong Kong. It's close to, all the Asian countries, China, Japan, Hong Kong.
So you've participated in KIAF for a few years. I was wondering if you could tell our listeners what the fair is like, what kind of place it holds in the Korean art market, and then also what kind of effect you think the incoming Frieze Seoul will have in this landscape.
KIAF is one of the oldest international fairs in Korea, which opened in 2002. So it has a long history and actually have quite a great influence to the Korean gallerists and collectors, I believe. KIAF has become an important fair, but although it's called international, they didn't really have the big Western galleries involved. So I think partnering with Frieze Seoul and having it at the same space will actually sort of benefit each other, I think, of KIAF and Frieze Seoul. Because for collectors, they will have a chance to look at, different types of galleries and artist works that will be shown in 2 different locations.
So you don't think that there's any sign of a rivalry between KIAF and Frieze Seoul? You think it's...
I think from Korean galleries' perspective, probably some would worry that, it's going to be taken over by big Western galleries. But I think they embrace the fact that it will actually create a lot more positive energy for both Korean and international galleries.
So you're taking part in Frieze Seoul, but not KIAF. Could you explain to me why you chose to do Frieze Seoul rather than KIAF this year?
We've already been involved in Frieze for London and LA, so it was kind of obvious for us to do it. We wanted to, of course, to do both fairs, but with the limited human resources and, so it was unfortunate that we only had to take one.
For what you're showing at Frieze Seoul, I don't know if you can tell us anything about the stand that you'll be showing, but will most of the works be shipped in from Seoul, or are you shipping in works from all overseas as well?
We're shipping works from different parts of the world.
And how have you found that? Because obviously shipping internationally has been a big issue in the last couple of months, due to both the COVID pandemic and also the war in Ukraine has also made Russian airspace kind of difficult to fly over. For South Korea, that's a big issue because obviously from Europe and also in North America, you do often have to fly over Russian airspace. So how have you guys been managing, this sort of shipping situation?
We're trying to be very smart when we do international shipping and try to select works from 10 different countries. We'll focus on maybe 3 different countries to do it. And also with the time limitation, sometimes it takes a lot longer, and due to unexpected cancellations and whatnot. So we're very mindful of that also. And most of the fairs, when you don't have advanced inventories, then you just have to work with air freight.
Thank you so much for your insights, Emma.
Thank you for inviting me.
Frieze Seoul will take place at the COEX Centre from the 2nd to the 5th of September. You can read more about the Seoul gallery scene on the website or the app. And finally, it's time for the Work of the Week. It was announced last night that the winner of the Loewe Foundation Craft Prize is Dahye Jeong's A Time of Sincerity, a horsehair basket referencing the history of Korean craft. Kabir spoke to Loewe's creative director, Jonathan Anderson, about the work, which is now on view in the prize exhibition at the Seoul Museum of Craft Art.
So before we talk about the work, could you tell us a little bit about the Loewe Craft Prize and why you set it up?
Yeah, I joined Loewe nearly 7 years ago, and when I joined Loewe, they had a foundation which was only awarding to poetry in the Spanish language. And I wanted to try and come up with something in which related to myself and the brand, so that I could kind of, in a weird way, work a way into the brand. Especially, I'm originally from Ireland. The brand is owned by a French collaborative and ultimately is based in Spain. And this was an entrance into me. I've always felt like there was a need, I think, globally for a craft prize that was able to kind of be used as a platform to really promote individuals. And that is why I set up the craft prize for Loewe.
So you host the prize every year in a different city, and this year it's Seoul, which is obviously great because Korea has a huge legacy of craft. And this year you're hosting it in the Seoul Museum of Craft Art, which opened last year.
Yeah, no, it's been fantastic to be able to have it here because I think what's amazing about Korea is that they have this sort of like inherent thing to kind of protect craft culturally. You know, there is esteem for craft, I think. I think people really respect it. And for me, it was just important to come here because I think, you know, if you look at ceramics, for example, or furniture, you know, some of the most modern thinkers of our time.
So let's discuss this work. So it's a 30 centimetre tall basket made entirely from horsehair, is that right?
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about how it's made?
Well, when I first saw this piece, I only saw it in images. I'd seen work in Salone and different places, but I'd never seen this one. And what is amazing is it's completely woven, and it's done out of a certain type of horsehair in which there's nearly like a translucency to the hair. So it nearly can look ambery in colour. At the same time, it can look like wire. It could look like glass. But what is so magical about this piece is as you walk by it, it slightly moves, catching the light. And at the same time, it casts these amazing shadows onto the surface it sits on.
And I mean, the piece itself is quite a technical feat, isn't it? Because obviously, when I say something crafted out of hair, it's difficult to understand how it stands up. But horsehair has this wonderful tensile quality to it. And I think that really shows up in the work.
Yeah, and there's an incredible, like, you get the flexibility and at the same time this wiriness that kind of like, it's got like a bit of a nervousness to it in terms of a material and incredibly strong as well.
I understand that the work also takes a very long time to make, that the artist is very particular about the individual strands of hair that come and then they are threaded around a needle. How long does it take to create this work?
And this is what we were trying to guesstimate with her, and we were talking about in the jury. Some of them can take up to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 days, depending on the size of structure. I'm actually sitting in my hotel room. I was just Googling other works that she had done where they're white. I think it depends on the intricacy of the pattern, ultimately. Some of them become more dense, and some are kind of slightly more opened in like kind of patterns, as you saw.
So the practice of horsehair weaving is actually quite ancient to Korea and China as well. Could you tell us a little bit about how the work is sort of connecting to the past, but also maybe taking it in a sort of modern direction as well?
Yeah, you know, obviously, for example, in Korea, they use it in hat making for men's hats. And they're these very kind of little top hats, nearly, ultimately. And they have like a brim on them. And what I think is interesting is that she has taken this technique and in a weird way turning it into a vessel form fundamentally is quite interesting and actually can nearly deconstructing the male hat somehow. There's something that I find incredibly fascinating with this because I think it brings it into this sort of air of nearly like an act of poetry somehow.
Is that something you see very often with entrants to the craft prize, that there's a desire to connect to a tradition that is maybe pre-modern and rooted very heavily in the past, but then is sort of saying something about modern society as well?
Yeah, no, we've had over the last 5 years a lot of examples of using a kind of ancient technique and then kind of propelling it into the future. But what I like is when you have this idea of skill or a technique and you are using the fundamentals, but you are changing the form in a way that it evokes a new type of dialogue. It is a kind of like a quiet form of being radical, ultimately.
You're a fashion designer. Are we going to be seeing horsehair on runways next season?
I don't know. I think the only time that we use horsehair in fashion is in a suit, in the canvases of a suit. But no, I don't know. I think it seems incredibly time-consuming for fashion.
It's called weft, isn't it?
The weft, yeah.
No, yes. Yeah, no, the idea of a horsehair basket or vessel also interests me because it's sort of also playing with the degree of practical application you can have for this object. It doesn't really seem hugely apparent to me why you would want to have a basket made of horsehair. Do you think that this work is also sort of intentionally blurring any distinctions between craft and art object?
As a viewer onto it, I feel like there is something about this actually kind of like removing function, ultimately, and kind of by titling it, and then at the same time producing something which is a container that ultimately will not contain, I think is very important in this moment, because I think it is something that evokes us to kind of look at the work in a reactionary way. What has been interesting is watching people look at it, and as they're near it and they're kind of breathing, you see the baskets move slightly. It's quite an interesting kind of process to watch. And at the same time, I think it does, in a weird way, kind of go into this idea of abstraction, ultimately.
I mean, that distinction that I just brought up about craft and art object, is that something that you even think is useful? I mean, speaking as a designer of fashion, but obviously, you know, that is also a form of craft and also some would argue a form of art. Do you think that upholding those sort of boundaries is at all useful? What can we learn from both considering craft and art as separate and then also considering them as one whole?
Well, you know, I think even in my own job, I always find that sometimes the things that are perceived as non-functional, I think allow us to progress things, you know. What fascinates me about, for example, this work in particular, or in art or craft in general, what I like is this idea, as a designer, I think my job is ultimately to look to the past. I have to reinvent the trouser or reinvent the concept of the clothing or the garment itself. And I feel like by looking to the past and historically kind of reconfiguring it and rebuilding it, and not being precious with this idea of ownership. I always feel that what is nice is this idea within craft is that the technique exists. You don't own the technique, you have to master it. And I think this is what I learned from art and from craft, is I look to it as a kind of sounding board, because I feel that, you know, it is about reinventing the way that we look at things, and sometimes to better or to change the meaning of that method.
Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. And listeners, if you see a horsehair appear in Jonathan's next collections, you know why. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you so much.
The Loewe Foundation Craft Prize is at the Seoul Museum of Craft Art until the 31st of July. And that's it for this episode, and indeed for this season. We'll be back in September and then with you every week until the holidays in December. Our sister podcast, A Brush With, is back with a new series of 4 episodes on the 3rd of August. And you can find that and the back catalogue of more than 40 conversations with the world's leading artists wherever you're listening now. We're on Twitter at Tan Audio and on Facebook and Instagram, of course. The Week in Art is produced by Amy Dawson, Henrietta Bentel and David Clack, and David also does the editing and sound design. Thanks also to Daniela Hathaway and to our guests Jiyoon, Kabir, Joorhee, Emma and Jonathan. And thank you for listening. We'll see you in September. Bye for now. The Week in Art is sponsored by Christie's. Visit christies.com to find out more about the world's leading auction house since 1766. Auction, private sales, online, art, anytime.